Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Milan from Trinity Business School, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this event of the Trinity Business Ethics Speaker Series hosted by the Trinity Center for Social Innovation. Our Business Ethics Speaker Series is now in its third year, and this year we've added a few hybrid events. You can see the whole program as well as a short video with highlights of the first 2 years, as well as full watchbacks of all the previous sessions on the Trinity Business School website. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker. I will do that more formally in a moment, and also my colleague Max Schormeyer. Max, perhaps I can just ask you to introduce yourself briefly.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for having me today. So my name is Max Schormeyer. I'm assistant professor in business ethics at the business school, and my research focuses on corporate sustainability and stakeholder engagement in particular.
Thank you very much, Max. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Professor Bob Eccles is a visiting professor of management practice at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford, and formerly from Harvard Business School. He was the founding chairman of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, and also one of the founders of the International Integrated Reporting Council. In 2011, he was selected as one of the top 100 thought leaders in trustworthy business behavior for his extensive and positive contribution to building trust in business. In 2013, he was named the first non-accountant honorary fellow of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, one of only 9 since 1999. And in 2018, he was named by Barron's as one of the top 20 influencers in ESG investing, and cited for being an ESG research trailblazer. But perhaps most impressive of all, I think his main outside activity is weightlifting, where he is quite good at the deadlift, where he achieved his personal goal of 400 pounds with a 410 lift in 2020. That puts him at the 99.8th percentile for his age group. And apparently, he's also credible at the squat, but pathetic at the bench press. So Bob, it gives us great pleasure to welcome you. I can't think of anybody more appropriate to talk about the topic. Our theme for this evening is turning down the heat on the ESG debate, which refers to a piece that you published a while ago. I give the floor to you. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. You're on mute.
I was on mute. You told me to go on mute. I forgot to go on mute. So thank you for the kind introduction. Nice to meet you, Max, and especially for calling out my deadlift accomplishment. I was able to do that thanks to COVID and the Magnus Nordmeyer deadlift routine. But it was like every Monday, right? There's things that you do when you up the weights. But now with real life back, I'm afraid I'm a long ways away from 400 pounds. And like I lift for a week or two and then I travel again and stuff. So I'm a little depressed about that. We need another pandemic if I'm going to hit another PR. I'm not wishing for that, but that's just the reality. So let me kind of lead up to this turning down the heat thing by kind of telling 2 kind of short stories. I mean, it's interesting to see how things have changed. You know, kind of one of the leading figures in ESG, it wasn't that long ago. It was kind of a good thing, you know, back then. Now, for a lot of people, it's not a good thing at all. And it's kind of from both kind of ends of the political spectrum. And I think that's interesting. And I think it has implications for how we think about ESG and how we talk about ESG. But if you just start with kind of a long-term historical perspective, if you said ESG 10 years ago, I mean, unless you were kind of in the business, most people didn't know what it was, right? It's like, you know, what is this acronym? And you could explain a little bit and they go, you know, I don't like it. It sounds like philanthropy and, you know, you're losing money if you're a company and you're losing money if you're an investor, and things go along. And I do some research with a Professor George Serafim and a professor at London Business School. George is at Harvard, USC, and we publish this, you know, piece that says, look, you know, kind of high sustainability companies perform better. George does a lot more work, empirical work mounts. And so it's like, okay, maybe this ESG isn't a bad thing. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board gets established. What are the material risk factors? 11 sectors, 77 industries. It's a relatively small subset out of their full list of 26. So it kind of crossed the Rubicon in terms of ESG is not concessionary investing, concessionary finance, that it can actually contribute to returns. But then I think where one of the problems started is that fund managers took it too far. And you've got the famous greenwashing case of DWS and my buddy Desiree Fixler, and they throw her under the bus. And then a year later, 50 German police come in and raid, the DWS offices, and the CEO, Ahsoka Warman, is gone. So Desiree 1, Ahsoka Warman 0. And the claim was basically, here's this ESG investing. Not only can you make more money, you can make the world a better place. You can save the planet. And it's like, who wouldn't want that trade? I make more money. That's good. I want to make money and I don't have to feel guilty about it because I'm making the world a better place. Well, that's not true. I mean, life is more complicated than that. And there's a basic confounding that happened in that. And I think this is really an important thing to be clear about the difference, is between ESG and impact. And I've written about this, quite a lot, Daniel, as you know. So just in simple terms, ESG are those material risk factors largely about a company's operations and activities that are mostly risk management, that are important for long-term value creation. ESG done well doesn't make the world a better place. It keeps it from being a worse place. What makes the world a better place is the positive externalities generated from a company's products and services can also make the world a worse place. And sometimes, they're combined. So life is never simple. And I think if we just sort of analytically were clear that ESG is material risk factors that are good for value creation, but don't say that being good on ESG necessarily means that you're helping to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, right? You got to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Is the framing that people typically use in terms of what your products and services are. So kind of the second story is kind of how we got to this stage of controversy, and then I'll kind of get into how to turn down the heat. Last year sometime, I published a piece with my colleagues, Colin Mayer at Oxford and Judith Strolla, who's now a professor at St. Gallen. And it was called The Difference Between Purpose and Sustainability, aka ESG, close paren. And it was published in the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, and we posted on the LinkedIn. And, and there was a lot of responses to this that were mostly negative. And it was like, how can you call ESG sustainability? And it was like, fair point, sustainability, if you're defining it as impact and ESG are different things. And I go, well, what I'm trying to do is just solve the two-body problem. I'm trying to explain, I'm not writing for like the inside crowd, right? It's like people are confused. What's purpose? What's sustainability? How are they related? So I was just trying to clarify that. And, we kind of do that. But that led to some unhappiness. And there was a particular group that was unhappy, said, post a counter response and, that's good. And I did it. And then I wrote a letter with an article in HBR, 1,300 words, thought it was pretty innocuous, with a woman named Bhakti Mirchandani, who's very smart and is the VP of Responsible Investing at Trinity Church Wall Street. It was like, the world needs universal ESG accounting standards. I mean, HBR picks the titles, and it's basically the International Sustainability Standards Board is a good thing. We're going to have reliable and relevant and comparable metrics like we've got for financial reporting, and companies should support it. It's the most views I've ever had of anything on LinkedIn. It's the most hate mail I've ever got on anything on LinkedIn. And it became vicious and vituperative and personal. And I learned about trolls. And so I blocked them to kind of clean up my LinkedIn page. And then I said, okay, now I think I've discovered, a particular group. And I wrote a piece called The Topology of Hate for ESG. And there's 4 sets in the topology. There's the sustainability Taliban. And some people think that they like this framing, and some people get mad at me and think I'm being polarizing, but we'll get back to that. Who like nothing's ever good enough. Single materiality, they don't like. They hate the ISSB. It's got to be double materiality. It's got to be contextual materiality. It's like on and on and on. Okay, so there's them. Then you've got the sustainability flat earthers. And you have a very smart guy, Vivek Ramaswamy, wrote this book, Woke Inc., America's Social Justice Scam or something like that. kind of rattles on about this and that. And he's starting a fund, and we'll see, you know, kind of these principles work in terms of the fund. But it's kind of this ESG hating, and ESG is like woke. And then there was an op-ed piece, or a letter really, in the Wall Street Journal, I think in May, former Vice President Mike Pence, who goes, you know, ESG is this left-wing progressive political and social agenda to accomplish things that they can't get at the ballot box, and it's attacking the American energy industry. He writes this. There's something called the Republican Study Committee that publishes a memo, The War on American Energy Industry, Ground Zero. Makes all of these claims. You've got something that I just wrote about, the American Legislative Exchange Council, on, you know, kind of eliminating the Boycott Provision Act, which you're ironically going to do by boycotting asset managers and funds that you think, by some bizarre definition of boycotting, which I can get into in a lot of detail, that are somehow boycotting fossil fuel companies, even though they aren't. And they're all mad at BlackRock, that's got, you know, a fossil fuel book that's basically in proportion to what the market cap is of the oil and gas industry. And then this morning, a friend of mine sent me this video from the State Financial Officers Foundation called something like, I should remember, Own Your Own Money, What is ESG? It's like 4.5 minutes. And it's like slick. You know, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. I mean, it's like laughable in some ways, it's infuriating in some ways, it's wrong in some ways, it's scary in some ways. Like, how did this ESG thing that 10 years ago people didn't even know what it was get weaponized? How did it get weaponized? You know, it's like motivating people, like polarizing, like guns, like abortion, you know, in the United States. And we see the polarization taking place. Although I am pleased to say that in the midterms, you know, kind of the American people basically are saying, maybe we need to sort of back off on that a little bit. So for what I want to do. So kind of what do you do when, and ironically enough, when you've got people not liking ESG because it's not true sustainability, that it's only about companies making money. And then you've got another crowd that doesn't like ESG because they don't think it's about making money, maybe even gets in the way of making money. But greater concern is that it's somehow a political agenda, you know, to sort of change America, even though board directors have a fiduciary duty and asset managers have a fiduciary duty. And oh, by the way, all this concern about how wokeness is taking over America. There's a very interesting paper by a professor at Harvard Business School and some colleagues that points out that 69% of the top 5 executives, defined in terms of what they're paid, are Republicans. So if 70% of the top 5 executives in America are Republicans, you know, did they all roll over? Or are they just talking woke and they really don't mean it? I mean, some of the stuff is just so absurd, right? But it's being driven by ideology. And, you know, the people that are doing the greenwashing kind of feed into both camps by making these claims about ESG that are outrageous. And so you have now a Republican Congress, and it's not going to be as big a majority as they hoped, but, you know, they'll have the majority. And there will be hearings, and there will be hearings about the SEC, and there's all this pushback about the SEC's climate disclosure rule, where, I mean, like, only in America would you have people saying, you know, your Securities Commission doesn't have the authority to sort of require companies to report on a material risk. Investors think that, you know, climate is a material risk. How are companies, you know, managing this, adapting to it, you know, attempted to make sure that they can continue to create value for shareholders. You've got SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, very libertarian, who likes to make her little joke where not the Securities Environmental Commission is like, wow, it's crazy stuff. So what do we do? Because I don't think this is really sort of good for anybody. So with my friend, my Republican friend, Dan Crowley, we wrote a little piece called Turning Down the Heat on the ESG Debate, Separating Material Risk Disclosures from Salient Political Issues. And we published it again in the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance. And it was like, look, let's recognize differences between sort of political solutions to problems like climate change, where it's a fair debate. What should you expect from the private sector? And I think there's a deep question, and it's a fair question that's being raised, I think, by some of the people that are kind of more on the conservative dimension of, what should the private sector do? What should the public sector do? But then you get into the thing, well, they don't want the public sector to do anything, but let's ignore that for now. Okay, there's different sort of political views on how to address a problem, but that's separate from what is the information that investors should have, that they believe they need to have to exercise their fiduciary responsibility for generating long-term returns for their beneficiaries, if they're the asset owner, or for the asset owner if they're an asset manager, and that's the client. And that's another thing where you kind of just see how ideology has come in. It's come in terms of what's the definition of materiality. It comes into the definition of fiduciary duty. I would say that you are violating your fiduciary duty as an investor if you're not incorporating the material risk factors. I'm not saying do every sustainability thing under the sun, all 26 things that SASB has. That clearly doesn't make sense. You're violating your fiduciary duty if you're not paying attention to those things. Ron DeSantis, would very much like to be president. And to be honest, I'd much rather have him as, I'm conflicted on this. I'd rather have him, if I've got to have a Republican president, and I'm not opposed to Republicans, I'm opposed to the crazies, but I got crazies on the left and right. I'd rather have Ron DeSantis as president than Donald Trump. But ironically enough, I think Donald Trump is an eminently beatable candidate if you're a Democrat compared to Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is quite an impressive guy in a lot of ways. He does a lot of showboating. He puts people, on planes and sends them to Martha's Vineyard, to make a point on that. And then passed this anti-ESG legislation. We're not going to have ESG in the Florida pension fund. I'm like, okay, great. Well, you don't even really know what it is. So I'm not sure what you're going to go find. And, what are you going to do? How are you going to take it out? So you're going to go tell your people managing the pension fund assets, if you keep doing this ESG stuff and you take out material risk factors, okay, you do that, and then you can hurt the returns for your beneficiaries. That doesn't make much sense. Or they continue to do it, and he's told them not to do it. So maybe he puts them on a plane and he sends them to Martha's Vineyard, in the wintertime when there's nobody there. So that'll even be harder for them. So what do we need to do? So what Dan and I are doing is saying, look, let's all take a deep breath and maybe just drop the term ESG. Let's talk about what are the material risk factors. Let's talk about what those disclosures are that are appropriate, that companies should be making, that investors want to have. Let's recognize the difference between, material risk factors and impact, positive and negative externalities. Let's have a discussion where there'll be very different views about, what can we expect from the private sector, what's appropriate, what's asking for too much. And I think, people that are more on the progressive end of the continuum where I am, I think are sometimes asking too much. They want BlackRock to do things that's not really within what BlackRock's, remit is to exercise their fiduciary duty. I think we need to talk about climate. I mean, DE&I is really a third rail in this country in lots of ways. I think that's harder. But there's a transition that has to take place. And I think we need to be practical. And there's going to be more coal than people want. And I think there's a role for nuclear. And I think there's a role for natural gas. And I have people who disagree with me on that, who understand some of these issues better than I do. But I can talk to them. And what I find troubling, and I find this troubling on the left, and I find this troubling on the right, when you're at the extremes, is that it's become like a religion. You either sort of accept the whole doctrine or you're excommunicated. And I go, well, I sort of think nuclear is good. Oh my God, Bob, I can't believe that you think nuclear is good. You're not climate friendly guy like the way I thought you were. You say, look, I think we need to pay a little bit more attention to adaptation. People go, well, that's stupid, because if we start talking about adaptation, that's like giving up on mitigation. And, if people are going to kind of take those doctrinaire views, and on the right, it's like, okay, ESG is like destroying the American energy industry, and that's why inflation is high and all is up. Oh, did you notice maybe that Russia invaded Ukraine? Have you noticed that ExxonMobil and the other oil majors in the United States are at their lifetime peak in terms of market cap? Did you watch the ExxonMobil investor presentation? I think in March, it's online, you can find it, the deck. It's bullish. They're going to generate $100 billion in free cash flow over the next 5 years. And they talk about what they're doing with carbon capture and storage, and they talk about what they're doing with hydrogen. And I've written about that. It's like, from my point of view, I think ExxonMobil should be moving faster. Do I think they're evil incarnate? No. Would it be good to be able to have more dialogue? Do I think what engine number one did was great? Yes. What did they do? This is the crazy thing. They don't stop. They put 3 directors on the board that Mike Pence, in a speech, I think it was to the Houston Club of Energy or something, 3 environmentalists who are undermining the company from within. I'm like, gee, I thought being an environmentalist was good. You care about nature and, fresh water and stuff like that. 3 environmentalists. Oh, who were these people really? They were people that have oil and gas experience, that actually know something about the industry and capital allocation, which their board has never had. They've got this blue chip board, gender diverse, racially diverse CEOs, famous CEOs of this and that. It basically, was exercising no control, over the combined chairman and CEO on kind of capital allocation. So I think that's a good thing. They're not destroying the company from within. If they were, why would their market cap be at an all-time high? So I think if you're going to sort of turn down this heat, you need to recognize, kind of what the facts are. You need to be able to talk about things that are uncomfortable, like climate, like coal, like nuclear, like we need to have a transition. I said I'm kind of given up on trying to defend the term ESG because people are reading into it whatever they want. The challenge, and this is where this is all getting above my pay grade because I've never really tried to move into which essentially is a political domain, is how do you create the same energy and salience being kind of pragmatic, right? You got the flat earthers and you got the opportunists and you got the Taliban and then you got the pragmatists. By definition, the pragmatists are going to be a collection of people who have broader views, who aren't going to be agreeing with each other and marching up in line to whatever the doctrine is of faith. And there'll be compromises. Just by definition, there will be compromises. Now, I'm glasses half full guy. My friend Dan Crowley, as I said, is a Republican, and he's well connected in the party. And I think that hopefully, this little piece we wrote is a signal to people kind of on both parts of the political spectrum. And that, in some ways, I think if the, Congress is going to have these hearings on ESG, then that's probably good. Let's clear the air. There's a lot of claims that have been made about ESG that I think are excessive. The corporate community has got to stand up a little bit more than they have, in my view, and the asset management community, the investment community as well. To the extent it's being weaponized by the right, or there's excessive expectations for what it's going to do on the left, I think they need to kind of call it on both sides. Is this going to be sorted out in a short period of time? No. But it's important to change the conversation. And it's important to try and create this space in the middle. And unless you live in this country, the UK is fairly polarized. In Brazil, as I was talking to a Brazilian lawyer last night, it's almost hard to appreciate sort of how bizarre it is in lots of ways. But no offense to people here who, most of you probably aren't American. We're still the biggest economy in the world, and we're still the biggest capital market in the world, and we're still probably the biggest polluter in the world, in terms of carbon emissions. And so we need to get it right for our sake, and we need to get it right for your sake. And that's why I think it's important that, here in the States, we try and find some way to put together this kind of bipartisan coalition of people to try and address an issue it's important for everybody, red states, blue states. And so maybe let's kind of drop some of the name calling and try and solve these problems that America is facing and the world is facing. So I probably talked for longer than I intended to. So let me shut up and turn it over to Max.
Thanks very much. And just before I introduce Max or ask him to take over, just a reminder that you can post your questions in the Q&A and we'll try and get to all of them. Max, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniel. I was also about to say that absolute I will start the discussion now, and then please jump in at any point and we can sort of pick up your questions as well. So thanks, Bob, for sharing some of your observations about the current state of the debate on ESG. I think one point that you flagged and pointed out very well is polarization, political polarization, and how that affects the ESG debate in the US. So one question that I have in connection to that is, if you look at then the European context and the ESG discussion in Europe, so European Union, do you think that would you say the status is a bit different, and with upcoming regulation, the directive that is being drafted at the moment, do you think that the discussion moves in the right direction there in terms of the political regulation regarding ESG?
So which of the many regulations are you talking about in particular?
The corporate directive on
the CSRD,
corporate governance. Yes, that is sort of
a different one, the corporate governance, not the CSRD, the corporate governance one.
Yes.
So I'm not as familiar with the corporate governance one I'm less informed on than I am with what's been going on in reporting, because that's what I've been following more closely. And
you can focus on the reporting side as well if you want, no problem. Yeah.
But I mean, the corporate governance is good too. And I think you also need to kind of throw in the taxonomy and the, SFDR and the Articles 8 and 9 and stuff. And then, what's going on with EFRAG and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, with kind of an emphasis on double materiality compared to the ISSB on single materiality. So, and all of those are kind of complicated, subjects, both technically, and they have, strong passions around it. So it's interesting. I was in the Netherlands a couple of weeks ago to give the Pete Sanders lecture at Erasmus University. And I met with, some of the big pension funds, APG and PGGM. And that was earlier in the week. And I said, Ilko van der Enden, who's the CEO of GRI. I mean, it's kind of like a different world. It's like the single materiality is taken for granted. It's like, yep, we get it that these ESG factors are important for value creation. We're concerned also about the so-called double materiality. And that's kind of the big emphasis on EFRAG, which is, these things that may not matter to value creation, but they're making the world a worse place. And we want companies to report on those. Both ISSB and EFRAG in their climate disclosure, they're very clear they want to have scope 3. I'm not so sure about that, to be honest, which is another kind of article of faith from my side. It's like being in a different world, right? When you're in Europe. The concern I've had, and there's part of it I like a lot. Okay, let me tell you what my concerns are. And I'm not, an expert on Europe. I live in the United States, so I have a better sense of it. I remain skeptical about the moving capital argument by having, kind of Article 8 and Article 9 funds that, this is going to sort of fund this green transition. I applaud the kind of attitude the EU is taking to see that, developing a green economy is a source of competitive advantage rather than it's being sort of spun here as more, okay, this is going to be sort of bad for America. I think that there's too much expectation about what reporting can do. So you can have companies report on double materiality. Some of these things they control, some of these things they don't so much. They're in their supply chain upstream and downstream. And unless incentives are tied to this, and there's ways to ensure accountability, I think the risk that you have is that these double materiality, if investors aren't considering them important, at least today, and that can change through double materiality, I think there's the risk that it become a tick the box exercise, and FRAG came out with like 14 different standards. And I think it would also be unfortunate if the ISSB and FRAG have, for the same topic like climate, different standards for reporting. I mean, that's not going to be helpful. It's just like replicating having IFRS and US GAAP. But I think that's going to sort out, kind of as I watch it and talk to people, in both groups. And so is the tone in Europe is different. This kind of debate is not the same. But I do know that business groups have pushed back on some of the FRAG stuff. And so I hadn't thought of it this way. If there's like too much polarization in the United States and we need to kind of find ways to have a conversation more in the middle, there may not be enough pushback that's happening, in the EU on certain topics that has become more, this is just kind of what the social consensus is, and it's harder for people to express any disagreements about it. But you see that captured. I mean, if you look at sort of the degree of debate, and it was really quite heated in a lot of ways, and it was hard to follow all of it because so much was written on whether nuclear could qualify, or gas could qualify to be an Article 9 fund. You see that same kind of phenomenon playing out. So what is your take, Max? I mean, let's talk, because you're probably more familiar. So tell me a little bit more about what this corporate governance directive is intended to do.
Yeah, I think the key point is to include sort of due diligence requirements for companies on human rights and environmental.
Oh, that's the human rights thing.
Yes, and I think that's one of, and also sort of extending this to a wider set of companies than currently already have these requirements. Some member states in the EU, like France in 2017 or Germany in 2021, already introduced legislation in that direction. But I guess it's again also about standardizing an approach across the European Union in that direction. So I think it's an interesting view. So my sense from hearing you speak is that it seems to me also that sort of I would call it a more narrow perspective on what ESG is and what it can do in terms of not double materiality, but single materiality, and really the investor perspective as the primary lens through which you look at ESG. And it seems to me like you also kind of propose this narrow view because there is this polarization in the US. And so you need sort of to turn down the heat and get it into this pragmatic field again, where solutions can actually then happen. We need this narrow view. So is that kind of a correct interpretation? Or obviously, I guess it will also, apart from the polarization point, maybe also have an argument why you think a narrow view is better in itself, even in a climate where you don't have polarization. So I would be interested in that.
So just one point, and then I'll address that. The other thing that I think you were pointing out, and it sounds like it's true with the corporate governance directive, is it's a lot more companies, and it's both private as well as public. I mean, companies that are of a certain size. And I think that's an important thing. I mean, I've done a lot of work in private equity, and I mean, it's a huge industry. It's $7 trillion in assets, and it's going to double over 4 or 5 years. And so, I do applaud what the EU is doing around getting reporting from, the smaller companies, because it all adds up. I actually wouldn't agree with that characterization. I'm not trying to narrow ESG because of the politics and the polarization in the United States. I would be taking that position even if it wasn't as extreme. It goes back to what I said earlier on. I just think we need to understand the difference between, kind of sustainability, using that word from a value creation point of view, sustainable value creation, versus sustainability in terms of sustainable development, which is more about kind of society as a whole and the impact, the positive and negative externalities of products and services. And so I think if we were more rigorous about saying, here's what single materiality is, and I agree it's focused on investors, I'm not saying the other stuff isn't important. What I'm saying is that I think then we need to be asking the question of, what is the role of regulation? If we think that there's things that companies are doing that enable them to have, value creation by managing the material risk factors well, but there's things that aren't mattering to value creation that are making the world a worse place, then I think that's why you have government. Now, clearly the appetite for regulation in the United States is less than it is in Europe, but trying to get reporting to carry that full load, as opposed to, having, like you say, with the corporate governance, it's a law that you will do human rights due diligence. It's a law that there will be a carbon tax. It's a law that you have to reduce your carbon emissions, measured in some way over some period of time. That's why you have governments. That's why you have laws. And so I think if we could sort of have this debate, and Europe may solve it more through, regulation. In the United States, there may be more of the private sector, and we're going to have, kind of the technology is going to come around. It's going to bail us out because we're smart people and stuff. That's where we need to be talking about the public sector versus the private sector, and addressing issues like income inequality, issues like, climate change, issues like the transition. But then you need to have the political will to do that. And a thing that I've been concerned about for some time, and I hear this both in the United States and Europe, is, and you see this in the talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, and we need to have like the $3 trillion, and half of that's got to come from the private sector. Are we sort of saying public policy isn't working, therefore the private sector has to step up and solve these problems? Well, maybe they can some, but maybe they can't some. There are laws, there's company law, and the law, company law in most countries is the duties to the corporation, not shareholders in the short term. I get that. There's fiduciary duty around, the investors to the beneficiaries. What if they can't satisfy their fiduciary duty because they're being expected to go out and essentially solve problems that don't enable them to create value for shareholders? If you don't like that formulation, that's fine. But then the issue to address isn't reporting. The issue to address is company law, right? And this is something Colin Mayer has done a lot of work on. And if you look at the modern corporation over the 2,000 years that Colin has looked at this, it's a relatively modern construction, goes back to the end of the 19th century. Before that, it's like, okay, you get 30 years, build a canal, collect the tolls, and then wrap it up, boys and girls. Now you've got limited liability companies that can basically do whatever they want in terms of products and services that they go into, can, kind of live forever. I mean, that's an enormous amount of power that's been given to companies, and it's been concentrated into a relatively small number. And you say, look, maybe that doesn't work anymore, that we need to rethink company law. And in the United States, you have something called the Public Benefit Corporation. You've got Delaware Public Benefit Corporations, where there is a positive duty that the company has to essentially an externality that the shareholders hold the management accountable for, just like they do with financial performance. And one of the things that's striking to me, and I hear that there's some talk going on in Brussels around company law, and you could confirm that for me or not, but what's missing in this discussion a lot for me is getting to the underlying core of company law and what the underlying law is around how fiduciary duty is defined for investors. Reporting is not a silver bullet. Man, what reporting does is it gives you comparable metrics that ultimately can be auditable, and you can compare them just like financial reporting, which is never simple. I mean, I've written about that. It's not nearly as easy as people think that aren't involved in it. It's not targets. It's not incentives. The ISSB isn't going to tell you you've got to make a net zero commitment. EFRAG isn't even going to tell you you've got to make a net zero commitment. Those are either voluntary commitments companies make, and they may be credible or not, or they're things that come from government regulation, or they're things that you kind of ground in company law. And the company law discussion is almost completely missing in this whole debate. And I think that's unfortunate.
So I have one last quick question before we go to the audience questions. And that's in relation to the ESG ratings that are coming up. And I would be interested in your view on in how far ESG ratings can provide an incentive for companies to focus on ESG, improve their ESG performance. So my sense is that this field and also the reporting field over the past 10 years has matured. So we have better reports than we had 10 years ago, better metrics, a clearer understanding of of constructs that are important in the ESG area. And then now we also have more mature, let's say, rating methodologies, despite all the criticisms that are advanced in terms of them not being regulated enough and them having different sort of ratings for the same company and so forth. But my key question is, do you think ESG ratings can be an important incentive for business to drive the ESG agenda, or do you think regulation ultimately is the tool?
So it's a good question. I think so. The ESG rating agencies, they're all getting hate over here too. You know, some senators wrote a letter to 51 law firms saying if you're helping companies with ESG, you could get in trouble when there's antitrust and blah blah blah. If you look at the ESG rating agencies, I wrote a paper on this with my colleague Judith Strola that I mentioned called Exploring Social Origins of ESG Metrics. Why do they exist? They exist as a proxy for the lack of good reporting on sustainability, ESG, I know they're different things, by companies, right? And it started out very different firms, and there's been a lot of consolidation. So some are more value-based, some are more values-based, some are more focused on social issues, some are more focused on environmental issues. They do the best they can, getting data from companies, other data that's in the public domain. It's not a surprise that these ratings vary. They're like a crude tool. You know, I think they will become much less important as you get standards for sustainability reporting, just like you have for financial reporting. You know, we don't have, you know, kind of a financial reporting rating estimating a company's profitability. We've got data reported on a company's profitability. If you look at sophisticated investors, they're not paying attention to some aggregate ESG rating. You know, they kind of want to know the component parts. They think it's, you know, useful to look for differences. They have their own methodologies. I think the ESG ratings, you know, some people hate them. Maybe there'll be more regulation. I think a better place to focus is on the labeling of funds. You know, the FCA has done work in that regard. The SEC is looking into it. Haas School is looking into it. The ESG rating agencies can't control how their ratings are being used by some fund to say, okay, we used some rating agency and we took the 25% and now we call it the green fund that's going to save the planet. I think the ESG rating thing it's more than a tempest in a teapot, but I don't think it's the fundamental issue. And what I tell companies is, you know, pay attention to the ESG ratings, but don't try and manage your company to optimize the rating. That's like teaching to the test, right? Because again, these are proxies for the lack of reporting. What you want to do instead, if you're a company, you should control the narrative by being transparent, by engaging with your shareholders, engaging with your stakeholders, you know, providing the information. As you have standards to provide this information, it will be better. And I think as that happens over time, this whole kerfuffle about the ESG ratings will become less, and they'll probably have to change their business models and get more into analytics than, you know, selling the ratings. That's my view on that.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So Daniel, I hand over to you for managing the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Max, and thanks. I think that was a great sort of introduction to start looking at some of the core issues. We have a couple of questions that have been posted, and I have one or two of my own. Bob, I think you can see them as well on your screen. The question from Grania, I'm not sure whether that's perhaps been sort of answered to already, or to what extent you would like to comment on the EU taxonomy regulation. A question is, do you have a view on the EU taxonomy regulation to provide businesses and investors with a common language to identify to what degree economic activities can be considered environmentally sustainable?
I mean, to be honest, I kind of struggle with that. I mean, if what the common language is supposed to be is SFDR, you know, and kind of how they get defined or around what is, you know, economic activities be considered environmentally sustainable, it's a little bit kind of a cart before the horse thing, right? Because, you know, then the debate, and it gets back to what I was talking about on nuclear, you know, who decides what economic activities are environmentally sustainable? And that's, you know, a value judgment. It's a social construct. And I'm fine with that. I mean, you know, reporting standards are a social construct. So I think, you know, if the EU kind of creates a social consensus to say, we are defining, these activities as economically, environmentally sustainable. And then that informs how we think about this company and whether this company can go into an SFDR 8 or a SFDR Article 9 fund. That's fine. Will that be the same definition that you get in the United States or China or something? Probably not. I think sort of working towards that end is a good thing, but I think we need to recognize that it's never going to be sort of a clean and settled thing. I mean, none of this stuff ever will be.
Of course. Thanks. And perhaps we can take the other two questions almost together, and it relates to sort of let me call it the sort of the competition between the E and the S and the G. And I know that you suggested perhaps we should move away from this altogether, but let's say for the moment, that in this environment, all of us would support the philosophy behind ESG. There's a lot of debate happening where people push specific agendas. I've been involved in some work where we define it as putting the G back in ESG. Marat's question is the question, why do the social topics take a bit of a backseat? And Na's question is on new form of inequality steering the green transition, which I think would also allude to some of the S issues in terms of inequality, human rights, etc. So yeah, what are your views on those issues?
So I'm not quite sure about new form of inequalities, but let me pick this up because I think it's a really important point. About 4 or 5 years ago, I did a project with the World Bank where I interviewed around 35 CEOs and CIOs of big asset owners and asset managers. It was like, what are you sort of worried about at the system level? And it was two things. It was climate change and it was income inequality. And they said these are both kind of destabilizing. We think income inequality could bite us harder and faster. They're clearly related to each other. And so I think you're going to see, and you see this with the human rights, directive, but more generally, I mean, there's a group called, the Task Force on Inequality Related, Financial Disclosures, and there's another one whose acronym I forget. But you see, I think, over the past year or two, an increasing focus on the social and a recognition that it's important. The ISSB will be putting out a consultation for what issues that they should look at next. And I wouldn't be surprised at all, that one of them is social, and it should be income inequality. And, then the issue there is, kind of living wage versus minimum wage. Will it be, diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then I think it's important to recognize, and this kind of ties into one of the further questions I saw down there glancing at it. There's trade-offs, between environmental and social things, and it gets into the energy transition and people that are losing their jobs doing fracking, what are they going to do? So the just transition, if you look at the Climate Action 100 plus, the one they don't have the methodology for yet is the just transition. And I have friends who tell me, look, until you address the E as an employee, my buddy Leo Strine says this a lot, I saw last night, you're not going to have the political will to deal with climate change. And I think a lot of where it's problematic in the United States is around the social dimension. So, you need to talk about jobs, and you need to talk about, people's children. You need to talk about, things like inflation. So I'm in complete agreement that I think we need to have a lot more focus on the social. It may be a little bit kind of harder to measure, but people think a lot of the stuff in financial reporting, like, derivatives, is hard to measure, and it is. You go back, goodwill is this way and goodwill is that way. It's impairment, you write it off, these are all social constructs. So in spirit, I agree. Yes, we need to have more focus on social, and yes, we need to have more candid conversations that, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Environmental and social issues, sometimes there's trade-offs, and we just have to acknowledge it and decide what they're going to be and be candid about how we made them.
Great. Thanks very much. I know that Max has to leave because he has to teach. We have about 8 minutes left before we close on the hour. Perhaps before we get to the other few questions, let me abuse my position as chair here to ask my own question.
Sure.
And because it is a series on business ethics, I want to just get a little bit into some of the normative or the ethical debates that play a part in these discussions. And what I want to ask specifically is, you mentioned at the beginning, in your sort of quick overview that ESG was sort of basically unknown 10 years ago, and we have this very sort of heated debate at the moment. Would you agree with me that in very broad strokes, if we think back 10 years ago, that to a large extent supporters of ESG and the way in which it was introduced into sustainability debates and debates around corporate responsibility had more of an ethical component to it, and it was informed by issues around ethics of care, perhaps, or the ethical, moral responsibility of companies to look at social issues, human rights, environment, etc. The environment, perhaps, an exception from earlier on because there was always scientific evidence in terms of climate change, etc. Whereas at the moment, I would argue that it is purely driven, from a risk stroke financial point of view. The reason why BlackRock and ESG investors are now sort of accelerating this is not because of normative concerns. It's simply because they understand the science, and that's why, as you said, it's ironic that some people would go against it for different reasons. But would you agree with that sort of basic trend of that we've moved from normative to sort of financial, if I could use those terms, and that somehow the ethical issues have gotten lost in the debate?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you look back, and the change in language is telling, right? It's gone from corporate social responsibility to sustainability. And, it's gone, from socially responsible investing to ESG integration, where kind of corporate social responsibility is, here's bad things we aren't doing, and here's good things we're trying to do for the community. And socially responsible investing was largely negative screening on a values basis, right? And it's like, we don't care if we're going to give up some returns by not owning tobacco or oil and gas or alcohol or whatever. And, that's fine. I mean, if people are making that choice, and I've written about that with my colleague Jill Fish at Penn Law School, called The Politics of Values-Based Investing, it cuts both ways. There's a fund called the Point Bridge Put America First Fund, MAGA ETF. They say, if you want to invest your Republican values, buy this fund, and it's defined by, donating enough money to Republican PACs. That's kind of the sideshow, though, right? And I think being distinct and difference between value and values-based investing is important. So your fundamental, argument, I think, is correct. And then that raises the question of, and it's a really important question to have, when you kind of look at the laws as they are, and you look at fiduciary duty as defined, and you look at what the role is of the investment community, and you look at what other stakeholders are doing that are kind of the conscience of society, right? The NGOs, how does one think about what is ethical behavior and what things should be expected ethical behavior by companies, regardless of laws, right? Regardless of value creation, and what things are going to basically have to be addressed, by laws and by regulation or by the investment community, thinking that this ethical issue is relevant to value creation. And so, just like with, this question of corporate form and company law is not into the debate, I think that there's really kind of separate conversations going on between kind of the ethics people and the ESG and the sustainability people. More overlap, I think, between the sustainability people and the ethics people. But I think it's a fair point. So let me ask you a question. I know we've got a few more to go. So is the curriculum around ethics, which is not a domain I know as well, has that been changed by what's happened, both good and bad, in terms of ESG and sustainability?
It's an interesting question. I'll try and answer in 30 seconds, and then perhaps we go to the questions from the floor. And Max, I see you still there, so perhaps you can weigh in as well. I would argue that we've seen over many years a shift in terms of business ethics research and teaching from the organizational to the systemic level. So we used to just look at organizational integrity, and now we get the integration of systemic issues into the discussions. That's one thing that is happening. And the second part is that within business schools, we move from, for example, courses on business ethics to, I teach a course on business in society. And we're also looking at responsible leadership and responsible management. So I would say there's a lot more integration and moving up the ladder in terms of looking at more systemic issues. The two questions from Louise, perhaps we should stick to the
Daniel, let me just
sorry, Max.
come in to say basically thank you for the session. Thanks to Bob for participating and for the great conversation we have here. But I unfortunately now have to go. So thanks everyone for joining, and I hope we see each other again at the next Speaker Series event.
Good to
Thanks
see you.
very much, Max. Thanks. Bye-bye. So in the 2 minutes we have left, perhaps there's one on SMEs.
Yep.
Comes back
So
to
Louise and
issues.
Julia, I'm going to try and do this real quick. I'll do those.
And yeah, and then one on the global north and the south. So perhaps and let me hand over to you, and perhaps we can also sort of roll them into sort of closing remarks from your side.
Cool. And these can kind of be my closing remarks. So and I saw that now Food sort of responded. So let me start with Julia's question. I think, do you believe the global north has a duty to help countries in the global south? I'm not sure what I'd say about more stakeholder-oriented capitalism. Whether it's like in some of these countries, kind of whether there's capitalism or not, I think is more problematic. I think just fundamentally, does the global north, if we're talking about climate, and then you talk about income inequality, I think the answer to that is yes. I think that's a political issue. I don't think it's something that companies can address directly. They can certainly take that into account, if they're operating in these countries. But, this is the big debate. It's what happened at COP27 in terms of, okay, you've got the global north that has sort of created the problem, and the people that are sort of suffering the most from it is going to be more the global south, so something needs to be done, kind of reparations are the term that's being used. So I think the answer to that is yes. What is the political process for getting to that in the global stage? Given the vast differences between the US and the EU and the kind of polarization that I'm talking about in the US, then how you get there, I just don't know. But does it have to happen? I think the answer to that is yes. In terms of Louise's question, SMEs, majority of the economy, will not fall in the remit of regulation. I'm a little bit less fussed by that. I think you got to be realistic about what the capacity is of these smaller companies. I mean, big companies, I know they're like looking at the CSRD and what the requirements are going to be from FRAG. Is like even ones that are really big and really sophisticated and you have a lot of the systems in place, they're going to struggle. I think we should recognize that a lot of these, SMEs are in the supply chains of these large companies. So even if the reporting isn't happening, there's going to be pressures that are putting on them because the larger companies have to report. So I think that's important. From a governance perspective, EU public, large, private, suitably composed to oversee their companies' work towards sustainable development. See, that's interesting. I mean, that kind of gets back to this question about ESG versus impact. And, I wouldn't say that it is the responsibility of companies to do, sustainable development. It is the responsibility of companies to be clear on their purpose, which means, providing solutions to people on planet, as Colin would say, without making the world a worse place. That's where the ESG comes in. If there's companies that are making the world a worse place and they're making shareholders a lot of money along the way, then that's where regulation has to come in. Companies that see opportunities to contribute to sustainable development through products and services that create positive externalities in a way that sort of fulfills their fiduciary duty responsibility to the shareholders, and you have to take stakeholders into account over the long term. I think that's good, but I think it's the slippery slope, and it's like this fundamental question that I raised a couple of times, and I think it's important to have the debate. Kind of what can we reasonably expect without kind of caving in, but reasonably expect, given the institutions the way they are, the laws the way they are, the regulations the way they are. What is fair to expect from the private sector, both the business community and the investment community, and where is it that we need public policy and we need laws and we need regulations? So Daniel, let me let you wrap it up because I see we're 1 minute over our time.
That's absolutely fine, Bob. Thank you so much for being our guest this evening, for your contribution. I think the ESG field is obviously immensely complex, and not only complex, but it's changing at a very rapid pace and it's accelerating all the time. So to have you with us to help us sort of think about the issues, to clarify them, and to focus also, and I want to come back to that in my closing remarks, your call for pragmatism and sort of turning down the heat and having rational discussions where we can agree to disagree. I think that probably is the only way forward. So thanks again for sharing your thoughts with us, and wish you a pleasant day further.
Thanks so much. Thanks for
Thank
the
you very
opportunity.
much also for everybody who attended, and please join us again at some of our later sessions. Thanks everybody, and bye-bye.